Composition in landscape photography, at its basic and most fundamental, is placing 4 lines, a frame, around the scene that we see in front of us, and then within that frame arranging the different elements, the different aspects of the scene to create a powerful and compelling composition, so that later when someone sees the image that we've created, they can look at that and they can share and feel some of the emotions that we felt when we were standing in front of the scene. Now, saying that is much easier than actually understanding what makes some compositions work and others not. And I find that when I'm leading workshops, communicating composition ideas is one of the trickiest things to do, because unlike shutter speed and things like this, which are technical things, composition is fundamentally quite abstract, and there aren't really any rules. I mean, for sure you've got things like the rule of thirds and things like that, which find principles in good places to start, but actually trying to communicate what makes a compelling image work and what doesn't, it's really quite tricky. So what I'm going to try to do in this video is put a few tips which will hopefully clarify my thought process when I'm making landscape images. And the first thing, I think the most basic thing that we've got to remember, is that cameras see things in a very different way to the way that we see things with our eyes. When we stand in front of a scene, our eyes are doing a really good job of editing and removing and creating a natural order from that scene by not seeing things that are there that we don't want to see. But a camera doesn't work like that. If you point a camera at a scene, it's not going to give you that same kind of editing process. It's not going to be selective. It's going to include everything in the scene, and there won't be any natural balance or order to it. So the first job of composition is to understand that, and to understand that when we put a frame around something, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how we order and how we place things in those frames to give it the most natural, the greatest amount of impact that it can possibly have. Now let's start by looking at Praia de Ursa, which is one of the most commonly photographed locations near where I live. Now, when you arrive at the beach, your instinct is to, of course, basically point your camera at this incredible rock stack which stands at the north end of the beach. But if you do that, there's not really much there. It's a beautiful place, but we don't really communicate that in the image. It looks a little bit flat. It looks a little bit two-dimensional. So what can we do to kind of give the image more depth, to actually create more interest? Now, the thing to understand is that our eyes don't just look at an image. They don't just fix on a point. What they do is they move around an image. So what we want to try to do is to put certain cues throughout the image to help the eye move through it. And we'll do that often with foreground, but there's not really any foreground to speak of here. We don't have a particularly interesting sky. All we have is just this one focal point that the camera's pointing at. And generally, when we're creating an image, when we're composing, what we want to try to do is to create points of interest, is to try to help the eye move through the image by using certain cues, certain steps to give the image a lot more depth and really pull the viewer into the scene. Now, the first and the most obvious way to do that is to use leading lines. So you can see in this photograph of these canoes here, I have very, very obvious leading lines. You've got all these parallel lines of the canoe and the piers going out along the canoes, which kind of pull the eye all through the image. The eyes like to move at a diagonal, and these canoes really kind of pull you into the image and give it a lot more depth. And they all sort of converge and point towards the sky where the sun was rising. But unfortunately here, there's not really a focal point. So we've got these lovely leading lines going through the image, but we don't actually have a focal point for the eye to move towards. So let's try another one. This is an image taken in Venice. Now, it's a very similar composition, because what I've done is I've got, again, the canoes, which work these lovely diagonals. They pull the eye on a diagonal through the image. But this time there's the focal point of the church on the island at the background. So what this does is it pulls the eye through the image and gives it a lot more depth. We have the church, but the canoes actually help the eye step through the image. Now, these are quite straight, but often we can use leading lines, and they're a little bit less obvious. Here, this is in the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. These kind of, what they are is it's where this is a salt lake, and the plates of salt have kind of pushed together as they expand and contract when the temperatures change, and push these bits of salt up between these different plates. And when you get the camera really low, what you find is these kind of create leading lines, which all take us towards this mountain here, which has just been touched by the last light of day. So we can find leading lines kind of by changing the angle of the camera, getting a lot lower to the ground. And the best kind of leading lines are obviously S-curves. Now, they work really well if we can start on the corner of an image and have an S-curve. Now here I've used a river which kind of curls in all the way up to the waterfall towards where the light, you can see the light streaming in here. So the eye is naturally going to follow this image, this line, which gives the image a lot more depth as the eye moves all the way across here towards the light. It's pulled through the image to give it a little bit more depth. Here's another example. This is a mountain in the Dolomites. It's the Trickiest. And what I've done here is I've used this path again to create an S-curve, so you can see the eye comes in at the bottom and it slowly moves along the edge of the path, following the light where it's just touching the side of this mountain here towards where the sun's setting. So the eye naturally is kind of pulled through in this S shape. So the difference between an image like this of a peak of rocks and the first image that we looked at, where it's very, very flat, there's nothing here to help the eye. There's nothing that moves the eye through the image. Whereas here, we've got a much stronger line here where the eye moves forward, moves through the image, and there's a lot more depth. So these kind of leading lines should be one of the first things that you look for when you're composing an image. But what do we do when we don't have any obvious leading lines? Well, one of the first things that we can do is look for ways to create them ourselves. Now, what I did in this scene that you can see here of the same beach of Ursa is try to use the receding waves as the waves were pulling back down the beach below my tripod, to use the waves to create lines using a half-second shutter, or you can use a quarter of a second depending on how fast the water's moving. And what this does is it creates these lines which kind of move through the image. These really pull your eye through the image from the corners along diagonals, but unfortunately we have the point of interest over here, so the lines aren't really pulling our eye towards where we want it to go, which is this rock stack over here. So it doesn't really quite work. So what other techniques can we use? Well, the other thing that we can always look for is object placement. Now, this is taken the same beach but on a different day. I was very fortunate on this particular day because this was a petrol canister that had washed up from the ocean, and it's covered in gooseneck barnacles, which is something that's really quite rare. So what I did here was I moved the camera left and right to try to find a particular way where the balance, where the arranging the different objects in the scene to create a balanced or harmonious composition. So again, once again we have the focal point here, and this is my first point of interest. So we don't have leading lines, but what we can do is find an object in the foreground, some kind of rock, or in this case the gas canister, which kind of works as a way of connecting the different points. So we have the rock here, the first thing that our eye moves to, and then our eye moves through the scene towards the main focal point. Now this particularly works here because of the balance, and it steps through the scene and leads our eye, giving the image plenty of depth. Or we can see a similar idea here, which is much clearer. We've got the main focus of interest here, which is this rock at the back. And what I did was I tried to find a rock, this here, and then another one, and you can see what happens here is our eye is following the water through the scene, looking at the different objects, which lead us to the main focal point. And then beyond that, we've got like a beautiful sky. So the eye moves all the way through the scene towards the sky. So this is an image that's got, for me, quite successful composition because of the different elements. They can be arranged in such a way that the eye moves from here to the main point through the image. But sometimes we're not quite so lucky. We don't have rocks, so we have to find different things that we can use for composition. What I did in this particular scene, which was taken in the Dolomites, was I found these patches of grass. Now, this is a beautiful scene, but just the reflection, this is the point of interest here. But just the reflection on its own, it's not really enough. The image needed something else to pull your eye in. I was shooting it wide. So again, I was looking for things which would bring the eye in from the corners of the image and move through. Now, so what I've done here is used this grass as a kind of landing plate. This is where your eyes come in, and it moves through the image, again to the focus point here, and then beyond to the sky in the background. So the point of the foreground isn't necessarily to have something incredibly interesting in the foreground. It's to actually act as a stepping stone. So this kind of pulls our eye in and moves us through the image to the point of interest, to the anchor. And it's the thing that it kind of introduces you to the image. It gives the image its depth and pulls our eye through. So our eye goes on a journey through all the different parts of the image until it reaches the back, the most important part, which is the mountain, its reflection, and the beautiful sky here. Now there are scenes when including the foreground can actually detract from the overall image, and then when that tends to be the case is when you're dealing with a particularly isolated scene. So here you can see this is a mangrove tree which is growing out on a reef with no context whatsoever. We've got a completely clean horizon, we've got a completely clean ocean, and I've given it a long exposure here which is sort of flattened out and removed all the detail in the water. We've got a beautiful sky, a very busy sky, but in this particular image I chose not to include foreground. I chose not to put any of the reef which was showing above the water if I'd moved a little bit further back, because it actually weakened the image. This image works better with nothing else. It doesn't need leading lines. It's just about this one image and the actual isolation of the image. The fact that it's not touching anything else. That's what the image is all about, the isolation of the main focal point. Another example is here. This was taken in Iceland, and it was incredibly misty and foggy on a glacial lake. So as you can see, we couldn't see any background whatsoever. The fog had completely removed the background. All we could see was these pieces of ice that were floating in the lake, and there's nothing at all. It was like a mirror. So again, I cut off the edge. I deliberately chose to not put any foreground in because I wanted the image just to be almost abstract about these kind of strange pieces of floating ice floating almost on the horizon. It kind of plays a trick on your eye. You're not quite sure what it is that you're seeing. But again, the removal of context, the removal of the foreground is what strengthened this image. And it only works here because the focal point, in this case the icebergs, and in this case the lone tree, have no context. They don't need anything because the image is all about the isolation of the focal point. So it's worth pointing out at this stage how important it is for an image to have a focal point, to actually have a visual anchor for our eyes to move towards and rest upon. Now, this image is a good example of that, or the lack of that. I managed to find a really nice foreground here, these lovely rocks that are being lit by the last light of the day, and there's a fantastic sky here. But there's nowhere for our eyes to go, so we kind of come in at this foreground and we've got the objects are placed here, but our eyes don't actually move anywhere, so it's quite a weak image, and because of that it doesn't really work. Another example is this one. Now I managed to find some really strong leading lines here as the sun was coming up. There's the sunrise just off the edge of the frame there with these receding hills, and these rocks have just been painted here by the first light of the sun. But it doesn't actually work because these leading lines don't really go anywhere. So what you can do in this case is make your own focal point. What I actually did here was to climb onto the rock. So what I ended up with was these leading lines caused by the rock and the very low angle of the camera, which kind of all point towards the figure here, which provides the anchor, and then the eyes kind of move onwards towards the sunrise, which is off the edge of the frame. So there's a natural progression for the eyes to move through the frame, and somewhere an anchor point for the eyes to rest upon. Now, it's really important to try to have this kind of focal point, and if the scene doesn't provide you one, then you can always stand in the scene and create your own. So you've finalized your composition, you've found your leading lines, and you've arranged your objects in a way that you're particularly happy with. But one thing you should always remember before you click the shutter button is to scan the edge of the frame. So basically you're just going to roll your eye along the edge of the frame just to see if there's anything there that shouldn't be there. So if you've got anything encroaching on the edge of the frame that really doesn't work, something sticking in that you're not happy with, and what you would notice in a scene like this is that the rock here is a little bit too close to the edge of the frame. It needs a lot more space to breathe. So you can see in this shot, in this composition, that the foreground is too close to the bottom. You should always try to give it a little bit more space to breathe. So the final composition, this one, you can see that there's plenty of space between the top of the rock and the edge of the frame, and plenty of space here between the gas canister or the petrol canister and the bottom of the frame. Our eyes can move around it, it gives it a lot more space to breathe, and then it gives us that kind of leading line, that passing through the composition from one point to another. Now another example of this is here. You can see I was kind of constrained a little bit with my composition here, trying to get everything in, but at the same time I've just got this tree branches encroaching in the edge of the frame here, and this rock which is sort of sticking in, and it always lessens. Anything like that is going to lessen the impact of an image. Something that shouldn't be there, it's going to distract the eye. The only features we should have in an image like this are the foreground here leading through to the focus and the sky. So just moving the camera a little bit Over to the right, you can see here, this is much cleaner. I've managed to cut out the tree branches that were encroaching on the edge of the frame and the rock here. So we've just got the foreground and the leading lines going to the main point of interest and the sky beyond. But this brings us on to another point. And that is the element of subtraction or minimalism. Have you included anything in the frame? Is there anything included in the composition that actually detracts from the image? Because if something doesn't need to be there, it's going to weaken the image. Now in this case, the tree here on the left, it adds nothing at all to the composition. It adds nothing at all to the overall frame. It just kind of pulls the eye off to the left and detracts from the thing that we should really be looking at over there. So just by moving the camera a little bit over to the right, now admittedly I got a much better sky in this particular morning, but by not having the tree over on the left, there's nothing detracting the eye. So we've just got the trees and the foreground here and the rock, and everything is pointing to is bringing the eye to the scene and the sky. It's a much cleaner composition, it's much more focused, and there's nothing to distract the eye. So this brings us back to what's the point of the image? What is it that you're trying to focus on? What is the story that you're trying to tell? What are you trying to show the viewer? And when you look at a scene, and if there's something there that doesn't need to be there, that it distracts from you, then you're making the image weaker. Now, in this particular scene, the mist was flowing over the edge of a volcanic caldera in the morning. Now, originally I started shooting it wide, so I had all the edge of the volcano and the edge of the caldera and the cliff in the background, but it was black, it was in shadow, and it didn't really add anything to the image. But what I really wanted to focus on was the way the mist was flowing along here, flowing over the edge and spilling over the edge of the caldera and flowing around these different pieces of land, and just composing the image, getting it tighter and tighter and tighter, removing any distracting elements until I had a really focused, clean image. This is another example here. Again, it's really clean, keeping the image tighter with the telephoto, tighter and tighter and tighter. So we just had the receding hills. This is seen through it's a mist of rain actually. It was drizzling quite heavily, and there's nothing else needed in the image. And this is a final example of that. Again, this is Tuscany in the morning. Now I could have included the whole scene, the valley going on with the mountain at the background, but what I found was just really wanted to show the way that the mist flowed around the different hills. And again, just by focusing tighter and cutting everything extraneous out of the scene, so really all we've got is just these edges of these hills and this focal point of these two trees on the brow of this hill here. That's really all the image needs. And the lines coming in from the side, cutting out everything on the right, it's kind of the eye naturally moves across the back of these hills towards these trees. And that's basically all it is. It's simplifying the image, cutting it down, reducing until you've got the image to its core element and defining what the image is about, with nothing else there, nothing else distracting, nothing taking away from the focus point and the power of the image. So I think that's it really. Those are the key steps that I think about when I'm composing my own landscape images. So just to recap, it's finding the focus point, finding what the image is about, and looking to see if I can find leading lines or place the objects in such a way that it's going to pull the eye through the scene towards that focal point. And if there isn't a focal point, creating one myself, or just seeing if I can, in particular cases, if I can isolate the object and it doesn't need anything else. Then it's scanning the edge of the frame, making sure that there's nothing too close to the top or the bottom of the frame, and making sure that there's nothing encroaching coming into the edge of the frame that shouldn't be there. And then finally, minimalism, removing everything from the image that doesn't add to the composition, and trying to keep the image as clean and as simple as possible. So if you've got any questions, just drop me a line in the comments, or just send me an email, and I hope that's been useful. And once again, thanks for watching. Take care.